Hello Street Talkers and welcome back to the channel. Today is an interesting episode. We have Dr. Simon Stringer, who's a British mathematician who's currently working at Oxford University in their theoretical neuroscience and machine learning departments, and it was a fascinating conversation. We're looking at the intersection of neuroscience and machine learning. Now, current neural networks are incredibly limited. They have no local processing, they have no kind of cyclical processing, it's always left to right, and they only have very basic encoding of information. And the TLDR of today's session is that we're going to make the argument that complex self-organized dynamics and sensory representations do not emerge from current neural networks. Now, when you speak to GoFi people and you speak to some other advocates of different methods of achieving AI, they tell you that neural networks are just building a taller tower to get to the moon, and we should be looking at entirely different methods. But one of the things that's really, been impressed on me in today's conversation is that there are lots of other ways that we could extend neural networks, certainly to be more biologically plausible and to increase their fidelity of encoding information. So importantly, complex self-organized dynamics and sensory representations do not emerge. What we're ultimately interested in is the emergent behavior, which is only achievable if you simulate the kind of dynamics that we have in our own brain at a very low level. Now, some people believe that there are sophisticated self-emergent kind of dynamics in GPT-3, which make it a kind of artificial general intelligence. I disagree. I think that the platform, the architecture, and the training context of GPT-3 is just far too basic for these dynamics to emerge. It's the information processing which is important, and that depends on the neuronal dynamics. Now, it's really important to start looking at some biologically inspired designs for neural networks. Now, one thing to get curious about is this concept of neural encoding. There are many different encoding methods that have been described in the neuroscience literature. Things like rate coding, which is as the intensity of a stimulus increases, the frequency or rate of action potentials or the spike firing increases. Another method, which Simon is a huge fan of and has done a lot of work in this area, is temporal encoding. Precise spike timing or high frequency firing rate dynamics can be found to carry information. And what do we mean by carry information? It's a little bit like, you have frequency modulation on the radio or amplitude modulation. So you have a carrier wave, which is a sinusoidal function, and you need to modulate it to encode information. That's what we're talking about here. How do you encode information in the neuronal dynamics in the brain? There are some other methods which I don't think are used in an artificial context, so things like population coding, which is where we represent stimuli by using the joint activations of a number of neurons, and sparse encoding. I found this on Wikipedia as well, where each item is encoded by the strong activation of a relatively small number of neurons. Some of Simon's early work was in rate coding using unsupervised competitive learning, and there were a couple of algorithms in particular that he utilized. One was called trace learning, which works on the basis of the similarity of signals in a contiguous fashion, so kind of temporal contiguity, if you like. And another one is continuous transformation learning, which I think Simon actually invented himself, which is about learning the spatial similarity of images over time. Now, these methods are really, really good at learning invariant representations, which means you actually have compositions of features at every spatial scale in the hierarchy, and things like rotation or location or scale and various different other types of invariance, depending on the experience of the learner. Now, the thing that Simon's been really interested in recent years is this temporal encoding, this idea that the temporal pattern of the encoding and some kind of emergent behavior or some complex dynamics might emerge from this temporal encoding. That's where Simon's really interested. And there's actually an algorithm called spike time dependent plasticity, or STDP, and he's been running simulations on this. And STDP strengthens the connection during learning if the presynaptic cell is actually participating in driving the postsynaptic cell, and if not, then it gets decremented. So this is actually a variant of Hebbian learning. So you've probably heard of Hebbian learning mentioned a few times in the literature. It means that cells fire together, wire together. So it's kind of similar to the kind of correspondence you see in capsule networks, for example. It's all about the correspondence of the inputs triggering some kind of behavior. So it's about increasing the specialization of every node in a network and therefore increasing the fidelity of the network. And the fidelity bit's really important because I think this kind of increase in fidelity might actually improve the computational profile of these neural networks as well. Now, what are the principles of Hebbian learning? Well, the first thing is a set of neurons are all the same, except for some randomly distributed synaptic weights, which therefore respond differently to a given set of patterns. Another principle is that there's a limit imposed on the strength of each neuron. And the final principle is that there must be a mechanism that permits neurons to compete for the right to respond to a given subset of inputs, such that only one output neuron or only one neuron per group is active, so on at the same time. The neuron that wins the competition is called the winner-take-all neuron. Now, one of the really important things we want to talk about here is this concept of feature binding, and this is part of the self-organized behavior that emerges when you do this kind of spike time-dependent plasticity. Right. So this self-organized behavior is really, really important when you have this kind of temporal encoding of information in neurons. And one way of describing this is a polychronization of neuronal groups, or the temporal dynamics of neuronal behavior. And when you study these dynamics as they emerge, one thing that Simon noticed straight away was these 3 neuron binding circuits. Now, this is the simplest kind of binding circuit. Actually, there's a hierarchy of binding circuits, and the complexity very quickly spirals out of control, so we couldn't even understand what's going on here. But this is a really simple example of you have 2 input neurons that encode certain visual primitives, and the encoding is actually a function of the time. The temporal synchrony is actually important in the encoding of this information. Now, an individual neuron could participate in hundreds of these polychronous neuronal groups all at the same time. So the complexity just gets absolutely crazy. It's only the tip of the iceberg. But what's really exciting about this is it gives you some idea of what actually goes on in the brain and why should we not be trying to make neural networks replicate this. So there's a great example here of a polychronous group representation of bindings, and it's showing every single neuron ID as a function of time and the binding relationships between them. And as you can imagine, these very complex dynamics emerge, and the neurons might be called again at different points in time, representing different features at different levels of the visual hierarchy. This is absolutely fantastic, and I think that these complex temporal hierarchical dynamics encode a robust set of primitives and better represent the semantic richness of our own experience. So I think one of the reasons why we don't have the robustness in the current neural network architectures is we are not given the fidelity that we would get if we had these complex binding circuits and self-emergent behaviors. What we need to understand with artificial general intelligence is that we will never understand the dynamics that emerge. It's an emergent phenomenon, and our ability to introspect and reason and understand what's happening will be limited. It will be extremely limited. Another really interesting comment that Simon made is that psychologists and philosophers have long regarded feature binding as the foundation of consciousness in the brain. So coming back to Hebbian theory, we were talking about that a minute ago, the idea there is that it increases the specialization of every node in the network and the fidelity of the network overall. And this feature binding thing that we've just been talking about, it's a really important part of achieving robust object recognition. And that also means generalization. So this is a system which can provide an alphabet of hierarchical primitives and then encode novel objects and recognize those objects, including from novel viewpoints. So incorporating that invariance to various different viewpoints and transformations. Another thing is causality plays into this as well. So when you have this hierarchical organization of visual primitives, if you like, the rich semantic information can be fed, from the motor areas and the visual areas in our brain into the prefrontal cortex, where we can learn causal relations in the world. Anyway, I really hope you enjoy the session today. I learned so much because I basically don't know anything about neuroscience, so I feel like a complete schoolboy here, and it was fascinating to get an insight into this world. I actually think that many of the things that we're discussing here today will be the kind of things that we'll have in our neural network models in the next 5 to 10 years. So you can think of this as being like a real, quantum leap into the future. Anyway, peace out.
Wow, we're getting professional here.
As you know, we're super interested in any parallels we can draw between the world of artificial neural networks and the kind of work that you're doing. But we'd love to talk about all of the work that you're doing in your lab. Without any further ado, let's kick off. Welcome back to the Machine Learning Street Talk YouTube channel and podcast with my two compadres, MIT Ph.D. Dr. Keith Duggar and Yannick Lightspeed Kilcher. Now, today we have an incredibly special guest, Dr. Simon Stringer. Simon obtained his PhD in mathematical state space control theory and has been a senior research fellow at Oxford University for over 27 years. Simon is the director of the Oxford Centre for Theoretical Neuroscience and Artificial Intelligence, which is based within the Oxford University Department of Experimental Psychology. Dr. Stringer's laboratory houses a team of theoreticians who are developing computer models of a range of different aspects of brain function. This covers vision, spatial processing, motor function, language, and consciousness. In particular, how the primate visual system learns to make sense of complex natural scenes. Simon's lab is investigating the neural and synaptic dynamics that underpin brain function. An important matter here is the feature binding problem, which concerns how the visual system represents the hierarchical relationships between features. The visual system must represent hierarchical binding relations across the entire visual field at every spatial scale and level in the hierarchy of visual primitives. There are different high-level topologies of bindings and synaptic connectivity, but crucially, Simon focuses in on the polychronization or the spiking neuronal dynamics in time. Simon's team have noticed a timing-dependent plasticity, an emergence of polychronization through successive layers of the neural network, repeating spatiotemporal patterns in response to specific visual stimuli in what Simon calls the polychronous neuronal group, representing lower and higher level visual features. Now, artificial neural networks also have a built-in inductive prior, which encourages the hierarchical organization of concepts. With vision models, it starts to diverge from the anthropocentric conception because the data is presented to us in a regularly sampled grid on a planar manifold. And the useful inductive priors, such as the convolutional neural networks, start to exploit symmetries and patterns in this very contrived and artificial domain. So I really hope we can draw some conceptual relations between how a computer vision model works in artificial neural networks and neurons in actual meat space. Anyway, Dr. Stringer, it's an absolute honor to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to join you here today. Really is. My background is straight mathematics. My undergraduate degree was in mathematics. My PhD was in control systems, actually working with British Gas, developing observers for detecting leaks in gas networks. After that, I moved into computational aerodynamics at Oxford. Then I spent some time in mathematical epidemiology. 1997, I moved into theoretical neuroscience. And I moved across from engineering mathematics into theoretical neuroscience because it really is self-evident that the brain can do many things that today's machines can't. And there'll be many areas where machines can beat the brain, but there's still a lot of tasks where the brain is able to make sense of its world and act with a sort of lifelike adaptive behavior that machines have not yet been able to replicate. So the approach I take to understanding brain function is a complex systems perspective. So a complex system is defined as a system of interacting elements whose systems level behavior emerges through the interactions between those elements. And once you adopt that perspective, then it means we have to look at the low level biology to really to see what's important in low level biology, which would contribute and shape the emergent systems level dynamics that we call cognition. And so that's the approach of my laboratory. So we pay very close attention to the biology. Now, engineers often tell me, well, we don't want to be constrained by the biology. I say, no, the biology is a signpost. It's telling you where the really interesting things lie. And so we take that long-term perspective, and it is long-term, which can make it difficult raising funding for this kind of research because it's not jam today. It's not as if we can sort of, if I wanted to raise money easily, I just offer to build a mobile robot to deliver pizzas in Greenwich, and it wouldn't be a problem. But to get funding for really long-term research where the applications are years ahead is quite tough. But nevertheless, this is our ambition and what we're signed up for.
I love the way you pose that as, or set the framing that, look, biology is a source of inspiration for where all the interesting things lie, or potentially interesting things lie, because it's kind of had this billions of years to evolve systems that work well in kind of this low energy domain. And we've often been wondering, so we stripped away all these features of neurons to get down to kind of like let's say some of the classical digital neurons that we've been working with. Have we lost features that are actually useful computationally? And I think your work, points directly in that.
Thank you very much for saying that, Keith. Indeed, the problem really, we all have this. We all say we're inspired by the brain, and but then we end up with convolutional neural networks. And the problem is, when you look at the brain, it looks like an awful tangled mess of complexity, an indecipherable tangled mess of complexity, and then we have to sort of reel back to something manageable conceptually. But certainly, the sort of networks used by engineers today really do bear very little relationship to the sort of dynamics which are actually taking place in the brain. So my lab at Oxford is really focused on building what we call biologically realistic models. So there are rules to the game. For example, plasticity is a local process that, so to adapt the connections between neurons, we use locally available biological quantities, which might be the firing rates or possibly the timings of action potentials and other local quantities. Again, engineers will say we don't want to be bound by this, but it's not a constraint. It's a signpost. This is the direction of travel if we really want to solve problems as deep as consciousness itself, really. So in terms of the sorts of early problems my lab looked at, we were looking at, obviously there was a focus on vision. So one of the early problems is how might your visual system learn to recognize an object from different angles? A very standard problem. View invariant object recognition. But we're not going to do this using a form of supervised learning, as in a CNN. We're going to use unsupervised learning because the way our brains work, we don't see labels over everything in the world. One of the most amazing things about the brain is it just learns to make sense of all this complexity on its own. So we used models which exploit unsupervised learning, specifically competitive neural networks, for example. So a hierarchical series of competitive neural networks where we expose these networks to lots of images, whatever those images are, faces, dogs, cats, whatever. And we look to see what the neurons learn to represent at different stages of the hierarchy. And there are specific learning mechanisms which will only operate in these kinds of networks, which look like these biologically plausible learning mechanisms that are able to operate within the context of an unsupervised competitive neural network, but will not operate in a CNN, in a supervised CNN. And so immediately, and we were investigating these sorts of learning mechanisms, for example, known as continuous transformation learning, which is something I discovered as a young postdoc, and trace learning. These are unsupervised learning mechanisms which the network can exploit to learn transform invariant object recognition. And these are some of the early work we did. So these are really biologically motivated architectures with the hope that it sets us on a path for even greater things later on. Now you've kicked off talking about some of our research on spiking neural networks. So a spiking neural network is really in the brain. Real neurons use electrical pulses, brief electrical pulses called action potentials or spikes to communicate with each other. This is how they communicate. And indeed, very interestingly, over the last 10, 15 years, neurophysiologists have found that the connections between cells, the synaptic connections, are actually the way they're modified through learning, through sensory experience, is critically dependent on the relative timings of those electrical pulses. So that's telling you something important. As theoreticians, as theoretical neuroscientists, we've wondered how important the spiking dynamics are. And certainly if you take a complex systems perspective, yes, you would suspect these observed features of cortical dynamics are important to the emergence of the representations themselves, the visual representations, and spatial processing of behavior and so on. So you're alluding to our work on the feature binding problem. So the feature binding problem is described by different authors in different ways. And the reason people describe the binding problem in different ways, because people haven't really understood what it is, because really to understand feature binding, you have to look at what's happening at the lowest level, at the level of neural interactions. These things are rather ineffable at a high level. To really understand what's going on, you need to look at a low level. Now, previously, people thought about feature binding as, well, I see a cup and I see all these features like edges and corners and handles, which are part of that cup. They should all be bound to the cup. And so people who were thinking about spiking neural networks, spiking dynamics, how could we exploit the spiking dynamics, were thinking, okay, well, let's imagine all the features which are making up an object like a cup. Those neurons representing those different features, maybe they emit their spikes at the same time. So in other words, they're synchronizing their spikes. That was the classic picture. But if you really think about it, what does that really buy you? And does that really accord with the richness of the semantic richness of our own visual experience? And psychologists have known for a long time that actually the phenomenology of primate vision is hierarchical in nature. So we see that this feature is part of that larger feature, and that feature is part of that larger feature, and so on. And that mirrors what you see in terms of the architecture of the visual cortex, which consists of a series of layers, a hierarchy of layers of neurons, starting at cortical area V1 and onwards, where neurons in successive layers learn to represent ever more complex and larger visual primitives in the world, which provide an alphabet to encode any new object. So really, feature binding, you should really think about it as being hierarchical in nature. And that's really quite a different perspective on what feature binding actually is. It's a much richer perspective. If we wind back to the earlier viewpoint that you look at any image you look at, your visual brain decomposes it into several discrete object regions. Again, it doesn't begin to match the semantic richness of my own visual experience. No, if you think about the architecture of, say, a hierarchical neural network like a series of competitive layers or a CNN, we have a hierarchy of neuronal layers where neurons are reaching threshold in a traditional network. They're reaching threshold, they fire. When that neuron fires, it tells you, oh, somewhere there's a cat. And that's all you know. You know, somewhere there's a tail, somewhere there's a whisker. So the neurons can carry information which can be measured about features in the world, different spatial scales. But those sorts of what we call rate-coded networks, where you're not modeling the actual spiking dynamics, don't keep a record of which inputs are driving a particular high-level feature neuron. They simply reach threshold and fire. And in other words, these sorts of networks are leaking away all that critical information about hierarchical binding relations between features. And you know, as a young postdocs, we sit around looking at our early vision models, which are not spiking, and we'd all want these things to be conscious and operate like the brain. We had that sort of aspiration, ambition, but we all had this niggling feeling that something deep is missing in these networks. And indeed, once you think about this notion of needing to preserve information about the hierarchical relations between features at different spatial scales in the hierarchy of layers, then you realize that's really critically important information for beginning to make sense of some complex natural scene. And indeed, beyond that, it's probably critically important to just basic object recognition in the first place. And so we're all familiar today with the problem of adversarial noise in convolutional neural networks, where one of these networks, you give it a tiny amount of image noise imperceptible to human beings, and suddenly the network thinks a school bus is an ostrich. And I'm sure that sort of lack of robustness is well, first of all, it tells you it's not operating like the human visual system, certainly not mine. And it's probably, I would suggest that hierarchical feature binding and preserving that information is probably relevant to that problem. There are other factors involved which I can talk about, but certainly hierarchical feature binding is part of it.
Could we just take a tiny pause there, because I feel that you've opened so many doors in what you've just said, and I feel like we're kind of holding all the doors and we need to close them one at a time. So one thing is, what you're talking about here sounds like an efficient encoding scheme, right? There's an information theoretical aspect to it, because if you can compare that to traditional neural networks, they only do feed forward. They don't do any local processing. They certainly don't do any time-based encoding or anything like that. But it doesn't seem entirely obvious to me how this kind of time-based or rate coding mechanism could give you the kind of spatial invariance that you were talking about.
So what's happening in our spiking neural network? So about the turn of the millennium, I think it was a chap called Marcus Diesman, he showed the emergence of synchrony in a series of layers of spiking neurons. And that was a Nature paper that had a big impact. A lot of people were talking about it, because a lot of people think about synchrony as a way to solving the binding problem. But in those simulations, either the axonal delays were set to 0 or they're set to the same value. And, all of us running those sorts of spiking network simulations at the time did the same thing. We would, because in the brain, the axonal delays between neurons, there's quite a distribution of them. Up to, for anywhere from 0 up to maybe tens of milliseconds. And so you can imagine in one of these spiking neural networks, if you put in those sorts of distributions of delays, you would you would disturb the synchrony that might emerge. And so, in early days, and if you look on our website, you'll see early papers on spiking nets where we're trying to exploit synchrony. We want synchrony to emerge in the networks. And so essentially we've cheated. We've taken out those pesky axonal delays because they're going to disturb the synchrony. And it was a wrong thing to do, because synchrony really buys you nothing. So what we've done is, in the very first steps, was to put realistic distributions of axonal delays into these networks. So we'd have a hierarchy of spiking neurons. There are 4 key characteristics we needed to incorporate into these spiking nets to get a way forward to solving hierarchical feature binding. So first of all, we need the top-down connections, which everyone leaves out. Indeed, a lot of theoretical neuroscientists would leave the top-down connections out of their simulations because no one had any really good ideas why they were there. People were thinking in terms of attention. You're looking for your keys. There's a key activity in your prefrontal cortex, which is feeding down to the visual areas, stimulating visual feature neurons that might be used to encode keys, helping those keys to pop out of a visual scene. And of course, that sort of attention is a real effect in the brain. But anyone who knows anything about unsupervised competitive learning would expect that those top-down connections are playing a critical role during the self-organizational process itself, during early learning. Indeed, one of my colleagues, who remained nameless, would run simulations where he'd have learning on the bottom-up connections. He'd fix all the weights and then put in the top-down connections afterwards using the bottom-up connection weights. Really missing the really interesting stuff about these top-down connections, that they could be driving the self-organizational process itself and producing representations, visual representations, which can't be produced any other way. So top-down connections turn out to be very important. Spiking dynamics, of course, and STDP, and then the axonal transmission delays. So this is what happens if we incorporate axonal transmission delays. When we train the network on such a network, a hierarchical network on many different object shapes, we see, and I'll describe the most basic expression of the concept. So the most basic expression of the concept is what we call a 3-neuron binding circuit. So I'm going to have to illustrate this with my hands now. So let's say we have a neuron in an early layer representing a vertical bar, and a neuron in a higher layer representing a letter T. Now, sometimes that vertical bar is part of T, but on other occasions it could be part of a letter P or some other letter. These sorts of feature neurons could just develop through unsupervised competitive learning if we were to train the network on lots of alphabetic letters. Now, in these spiking nets, with these top-down lateral and bottom-up connections, axonal delays, what we see is the emergence of lots of these 3-neuron binding circuits where these two neurons, the lower-level feature neuron and the high-level feature neuron, are then projecting to a third neuron, which we call a binding neuron. And what we find is that the axonal delay from here to here is approximately equal to the delay from here to here to here. Now, this is much easier to show in a PowerPoint presentation, but I don't have that now. I'm hoping this will come across clearly. But we see these circuits of 3 neurons, so lower feature, higher feature, binding neuron, where the delay from the lower feature neuron to the binding neuron is approximately equal to the delay from the lower feature neuron to the higher feature neuron, and then from the higher feature neuron to the lower feature neuron. So what happens if that pattern of axonal delays emerges through learning, which it does? Well, then what happens is that this binding neuron, if we were in a rate-coded network where we're not modeling the spiking dynamics, that binding neuron would have the property that it would fire if it's being driven by these two being simultaneously active. So if these two neurons are simultaneously active, they'll drive that third binding neuron. But that's of no interest whatsoever. That's just telling us these two are co-active. We're not interested in that. We want to know specifically, is that feature part of that feature? Is that neuron driving that neuron? And only by utilizing the spiking dynamics will this neuron then, this binding neuron, this third binding neuron, inherit the firing property that it fires if and only if this is actually driving that. The spikes flow around that 3-neuron binding circuit to achieve that. So then that means that third binding neuron comes to carry measurable information about the binding relationship between those two features. So in other words, if that lower level feature was not participating in driving the high level feature, maybe because the lower level feature was part of a different alphabetic letter, then the spikes from these two neurons don't arrive at the same time at the third neuron and make it fire. That's how it works.
What you've described there sounds very similar to capsular networks. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. And even though capsular networks don't use spiking dynamics, they have something which is very similar to an attention system or a routing system, which is where things can be activated as a function of their context or their pose. And even though it's in this substrate of neural networks, you can use it to define quite complex compositional relationships between objects in a scene. So I suppose I'm looking for, what do we get with it? Is it just a meat space thing, this spiking?
Yes, of course, we've looked at capsular networks, and we've and it's a really interesting question to try to compare capsular networks with what's happening in our spiking nets. We're of the view that what's happening in the spiking nets is rather different. I know these are, in some sense, they're trying to tackle rather similar problems, but we think what's happening in the spiking nets is rather different. And I would be very pleased to hear your point of view on this when I've managed to describe exactly what's happening in the spiking nets. So what I've said is we have a feature down here that itself may be invariant. In fact, in our simulations, it often is. And these, and you asked me about invariance learning mechanisms, spiking nets, and we've actually taken the early work we did on rate-coded networks on these unsupervised invariance learning mechanisms, such as continuous transformation learning and trace learning, and ported them into a spiking network, so to speak, and they operate perfectly well in a spiking network. So those unsupervised learning mechanisms will produce features at every spatial scale in the hierarchy which display some kind of invariance. Maybe it's rotation invariance or location invariance or scale invariance. So in our networks, we see a hierarchy of these features emerging through sensory experience, where the features themselves display a level of invariance. And what I'm describing now, how when we have two features which one is going to drive the other because maybe this edge is part of that cup or this bar is part of the T, there's going to be a third neuron which will come to explicitly represent that binding relation between the two. In other words, that third neuron will only fire if that feature is specifically part of that feature in the processing. And not only that, we find much more complex binding circuits emerging, but then it gets very, very complex trying to analyze what's going on. So it can get tremendously rich. What I should also say is why that happens. So I said we need that specific pattern of axonal delays. Obvious question is, well, how does that emerge through self-organization? Let me say a couple of things there. So we're implementing sort of quite a standard form of what's called spike time dependent plasticity, otherwise known as STDP. And this is a form of plasticity that operates at a synapse, which will strengthen or weaken that synaptic connection, but it depends critically on the relative timings of the action potentials or spikes from the pre and post synaptic cells, from the sending and receiving cells. And specifically, if the spike from the sending cell arrives just before the spike from the receiving cell, then we get LTP, long-term potentiation. So the synapse gets strengthened. If it's the other way around, if the postsynaptic neuron fires first, emits a spike first, then we get LTD, long-term depression. So the connection gets weakened. And very interestingly, this is very much in line with the original postulate of Donald Hebb. So we have something called the Hebb rule in theoretical neuroscience, which simply wires together neurons that fire together. Now, the Hebb rule is implemented in rate-coded networks and does not take into account spike times because rate-coded networks don't simulate spike times. It simply says we strengthen a connection if two neurons are active at the same time. That's not quite what Donald Hebb said. He said he postulated that you would get enhancement of a connection if the presynaptic cell was participating in driving the postsynaptic cell. That's much more specific. And it turns out that is actually what you see in the brain when you look at STDP. So the STDP model that we've implemented, it will strengthen a connection if during learning the presynaptic cell is actually participating in driving the postsynaptic cell, and if it's not, then it gets decremented.
So doesn't your paper, I'm pretty sure it made the point that, rate encoding is probably, at least there's a lot of evidence just from the timing at which our brain can calculate things, that it's not feasible to do rate encoding, that there's just not even enough time to really sample the rate reliably.
Yeah, there are probably arguments to that effect, but certainly when you talk to the neurophysiologists, what they've observed is a critical dependency on relative spike times. That's what's been observed in the neurophysiology.
No, that I buy, but that's not so much rate encoding, is it? That's really more what you're talking about, which is this delta, this time delta.
These are very different things. So the rate encoding, like a Hebb rule, is a very different beast to spike time dependent plasticity, which we can only implement in a spiking network. Absolutely. Right. And so what we found is that's a critical part of the story. So with that sort of STDP I've just described, there are natural time constants associated with it. And if you lengthen those time constants so much that you lose the temporal precision, then you're back to sort of rate coding sort of situation. And then we lose the emergence of what we call polychronization, or this rich spatial temporal structure. So the STDP does seem to be important to that. And so it takes a bit of thinking about, but if we implement that kind of STDP I've just described, then you can see intuitively how we get these three neuron binding circuits emerging, how that third binding neuron will learn to respond to the simultaneous arrival of two spikes from the other two cells. So you can just see intuitively, it takes a bit of thinking about, you can see intuitively how that form of STDP will promote the emergence of those three neuron binding circuits and other kinds of binding circuits, more complex forms. Other simulations we run are, for me, even more interesting. So actually, when you look at a real neuron, you see a rich dendritic tree. And the axon from the presynaptic cell may weave its way through that dendritic tree, making multiple synaptic contacts, where each of those synaptic contacts might have a different axonal delay associated with it. And what we found is when we implement this in our simulations, the network is able to preferentially strengthen some synaptic connections and not others according to the actual delays. And so that's a way in which the axonal delays themselves can self-organize to promote the emergence of the spatial temporal structure. Which is a lovely result. But beyond that, I think the most interesting thing about all of this is that so where does all this spatial temporal structure come from? Well, actually, so the original simulations carried out by Marcus Diesman, he showed the emergence of synchrony when the input spikes were quite decorrelated. They were quite spread out in time. So he just saw over a series of layers that gradual emergence of synchrony as the packet of spikes got more and more narrow through time. So he saw the emergence of synchrony. So in our simulations, we also have randomized spike times in the input layer. And simply as they propagate up successive layers, the polychromy, call it polychromy or polychronization, just emerges naturally. So all the spatial temporal structure just emerges naturally during learning. So you get something from nothing. It's very curious. It's extraordinary, really.
This is really interesting. We were speaking with Max Welling a few weeks ago, and he is the deep learning researcher most famous for creating sophisticated inductive priors in deep neural networks to do things like rotational invariance and symmetries and different manifolds and so on. This bias variance trade-off, it presupposes that in order for you to learn in an efficient way, you need to encode some knowledge into the neural network. And it must be a similar thing in the brain. But the way you're describing this with this kind of self-organized behavior, it sounds a little bit like you think of the brain as being a blank slate.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of self-organization, absolutely. And that can be a problem in the simulations because it might not learn what you want it to learn. But if I give you some examples of some of the successes using this approach. So, and most of our early work was using rate-coded models. And rate-coded models can still take you a long way, even if they don't solve binding. So one of the early problems we're interested in is how the brain learns to represent the spatial structure of objects, the shapes of objects. Another problem we've looked at is how the brain learns to represent the spatial structure of faces. So when you think about recognizing faces, and if I was to wind back to my postdoc days, we'd have a network and we want to train it on a face from one view and hope they could recognize that face from another view. And by recognize, we simply mean the same output neurons end up firing. So in other words, it's just straight categorization. So we really do. When we think about recognizing an object, we think in terms of categorization. But actually, if I was to show you a rotating cube, you'd not only better recognize that cube from different angles, but you'd see that cube. You'd see all the internal structure, the features of different spatial scales and how they're related to each other. And that is something that we don't tend to think about so much. Now, neurophysiologists have actually, by recording from cells in the primate brain, been able to show that lots of neurons, through successive stages of visual processing, encode shape primitives. Those primitives might be boundary contour elements. So an individual cell in areas such as cortical area V4 would encode a local boundary contour element where the cell is sensitive to the conformation of that boundary element, so whether it's concave, convex, and also the position with respect to center of gravity of that object. And then across a whole population of these cells, any two-dimensional 3D shape can be encoded by a subpopulation of those cells. We have a distributed representation of shape. And so we've simulated that effect. We've trained one of our early networks, a hierarchy of layers using competitive learning on lots of 2D object shapes. And we've seen the emergence of exactly these sorts of shape features that are seen in the brain. And in analogous simulation studies, we've trained the same network architecture on a couple of hundred faces using software called FaceGen, which generates very realistic faces, 3D faces. We've trained the network on a couple of hundred randomly generated faces, and we've seen the emergence of a rich hierarchy of feature primitives, neurons encoding feature primitives used to represent faces, so neurons encoding an eye, a nose, a mouth, or possibly the distance between the eyes. So neurophysiologists have found a great variety of cells which encode geometric relations within the face between features, and all of these geometric relations pop out of our simulations. The network just learns to represent the same features that are found by neurophysiologists in the brain. And not only that, one of the most interesting problems was that when you look at someone, you can see their identity and you can see their expression at the same time. And neurophysiologists have found separate subpopulations of cells encoding either facial identity or facial expression. So how might they develop in the brain, since you always see these two perceptual dimensions combined in any face you look at? And we just simply exposed our networks, our unsupervised self-organizing networks, to hundreds of faces, and these sorts of cells which were responsive either to identity irrespective of expression or responsive to expression irrespective of identity just popped out of the simulations. And we do have a theoretical understanding of how that works. That's really to do with these two spaces being decorrelated, and that forces, through competitive learning, the neurons to learn to go to individual perceptual spaces like identity and expression.
If I'm seeing a cube versus closing my eyes and imagining that same cube is there an overlap in the structures in my brain that light
Yes,
up?
and there is. And not exactly the same experience, is it? But yes, absolutely. You see the same sorts of structures in the visual brain light up when you're trying to imagine an object or a face.
Right, because what I'm wondering about is sort of, the point that a lot of, like, let's say the symbolic oriented AI folks believe is that ability to construct this representation, if you will, in your mind of that object. Because when I imagine it, I can rotate it, I can scale it, I can imagine, many of them together rotating and scaling. That may be an essential part of this whole processing.
Oh, I think so. And indeed, some of my colleagues at Oxford are working on working memory. So working memory is something that's thought to take place in your prefrontal cortex. So after layers of visual processing, there'll be a representation of some object in working memory. But, today, the way other people model working memory is they use these attractor networks. But these are typically rate-coded attractor networks, where, again, you have this sort of population code, which just represents the category of an object, for example. Now, if you think about what I've been saying about these spiking networks, this hierarchy of layers, which are encoding features at every spatial scale and the binding relations. In fact, what we're seeing in our simulations that I haven't mentioned yet is that the classic way you think about these networks is the output layers are giving you the category of object. But what we're seeing in our spiking networks is evidence that features at every spatial scale, including the hierarchical binding relations, are all being propagated up in some form for readout. And that's extraordinary. We call that the holographic principle. And that will surely accord with the semantic richness of our own visual experience, where when we look at the world, we're not just aware there's a cat, but we see the cat and all the features that make up that cat. And surely that semantic richness of our visual experience is important for guiding our behavior in the world, and indeed would underpin our general intelligence. So this is probably a roadmap for the future development of artificial general intelligence. If we come up to prefrontal cortex then, and we think about attractors, what we hope to do in the future is extend our vision models into a prefrontal cortex where we can model attractor dynamics, where within those spiking attractor states, there'll be a rich array of information about features at different spatial scales and how they're bound together to address the issue you've just raised. But that's in the future.
So another interesting question is we've been speaking with Gary Marcus, who's quite a famous professor who criticizes deep learning. And the thing in the background with deep learning is you will always have folks that say it's basically memorization. Professor Pedro Domingos just last week, I think, released a paper likening neural networks to kernel machines. And what's interesting about kernel machines is that they are non-parametric methods that basically learn kind of in a product space between the data examples, which means it must be just interpolating between the examples. This notion of representational learning might be kind of exaggerated. But the thing is, Gary Marcus would say that the core problem in these perception models is the kind of missing information problem, right? We do reasoning. Let's say if I say the corner table wants a beer, we know that it's a person because that information is missing, but we've done some reasoning over some world knowledge. And similarly, I want to get to how do you do this invariance in scene understanding? Because as good as the features learned are, you need to fill in the missing gaps through some high level of reasoning.
Yeah, let's pick up on that. So, people talk about neural networks generalizing. I'm not sure about, how successful CNNs are if you need to train them on 10,000 images of a cat before you can recognize a new cat. So we've actually, to address your point, in our biological models, which are unsupervised, in some of the simulation studies, we simply expose the early layers to just random visual experience, just to build random feature analyzers. And because we have very different learning mechanisms, and I should also say that with these unsupervised networks, the features which the network learns will be rather different to the sorts of features that a CNN might learn. But using these invariance learning mechanisms I described earlier, what we find is those features which get set up in the early layers display some level of transform invariance. And that can include not just location invariance, but also scale invariance and view invariance, rotation invariance. What that then, when we've published all this, what that then allows you to do is show one of these networks just one shot view of an object, a three-dimensional object, and then rotate it, and it only needs one shot view. It's happily because what you've built it is an alphabet of visual spatial primitives, which themselves display transform invariant by the same learning mechanisms, which can be used to encode any novel object. Which then you show that object in a different viewpoint. It will just the same primitives are stimulated, and it will fire up the same output representation. And so in other words, I began at the beginning saying I suspected feature binding is an important part of achieving robust object recognition, and that means generalization. But I think there are other things going on as well, like the fact that within one of these biological unsupervised networks, you form a hierarchy of very different kinds of visual spatial primitives, which can provide an alphabet of primitives to encode novel objects and then recognize those objects from novel viewpoints. Again, all of this is backed up by the neurophysiology. Everything that comes out of our simulations has been seen in neurophysiological studies.
What you're saying essentially is that the only reason neural networks don't work is because they don't have a sophisticated enough compositional feature binding relationship. And in principle, you think that the brain does learn simple visual primitives and it has a very sophisticated compositional mechanism to give us that level of generalization. That is what you're saying.
Yes. I mean, there are multiple mechanisms at work. If you look at our research over 20 years, it's like one thing goes on after the next. Everything builds on what went before. And so what we're looking to do in terms of next steps with these spiking models is to replicate some of the earlier rate-coded studies on object shape. So far we've looked at the emergence of feature binding, hierarchical feature binding in spiking nets. Now we want to start training it on more realistic problems, maybe lots of faces or 2 or 3 dimensional objects, and look at the emergence of this hierarchy of features where the features themselves display transform invariance so that they can be used to do one-shot learning on novel objects. And indeed, we've begun a collaboration with Imperial College London to actually carry out some of these simulations at the moment.
I'm quite interested in this kind of hierarchy of features. From your experience, is it the case that there are, if this is hierarchical, there are these low-level features, and is a certain low-level feature part of one or few or many high-level features? How does that all work? Do we have sort of this kind of alphabet that can compose into many words, or?
Yeah, exactly that. So, and this is the correspondence problem between the layers. Every time you present a new image, there'll be a different relationship between the low and high level features, and that needs to be represented explicitly so it can be used. That kind of binding information can be used. That's exactly right. Can I just say, we've talked a lot about vision, but there are other parts of the brain which are also interesting. One area, for example, is auditory processing of speech. And you've got, similar sort of architecture there, and sort of hierarchy of layers of spiking neurons. And speech itself is a hierarchical structure. So, this vowel would be part of this phoneme, part of this suprasegmental part of this word, and so on. So when we hear speech, there's all sorts of binding going on as we're interpreting what we're hearing, including actually binding speech to the identity of a speaker who's currently talking to us, maybe interpreting their emotional valence, or things like gender and age. This is all bound together. And so we've got analogous hierarchical binding problems in auditory processing speech. And that's one of the areas we also want to look at, whether we can improve robustness of speech recognition, particularly against noisy backgrounds using these sorts of spiking networks. And then the motor system. The motor system is, again, a hierarchy of layers of spiking neurons where neurophysiologists find, again, you have motor primitives of increasing spatial temporal scale to successive layers. And there must be analogous feature binding mechanisms. And then beyond that, well, we've actually tried to build complete models of brain function. By that, I don't mean simulating 100 billion neurons, but something that might have arisen in the Cambrian explosion 500 million years ago, something quite simple, with a simple sensory input, maybe some simple photoreceptors, some simple output actuators, and a layer of neurons in the middle that can learn to do some decision making. You can actually see the simulations on our website. So we built a system that's the very, very simple architecture that can learn about causal relations in the world. And we've dropped this into, for example, 2-dimensional mazes. It's able to, just by moving around randomly, learn about the spatial structure of the maze, so that later on you can put this agent back in the maze and it can navigate to any target location in the maze. And the critical thing is, if you change the structure of that maze, it can then automatically, you can learn about the new, say, maybe you put a blockage along a route, so it can't take that route. It can bump into it, automatically learn about it, and then use its world knowledge to take the next shortest route. And of course, this was shown by Edward Tolman in the 1930s, a famous psychologist, with rats. Rats can do exactly this. So rats, even a humble rat with a tiny brain, can learn about causal relations in its world, the topology of its environment, and use that to guide behavior. And that is, you might remember that the original applications that brought DeepMind to fame were learning to play Atari computer games using model-free reinforcement learning. And so, back in the 1930s, Edward Tolman showed the behavioral advantage of being able to learn a model of the world to provide you with adaptable, flexible behavior in a changing environment. And so we're always driven by the biology here. But if we just focus on that model a bit more, we've got a visual system, visual input, motor output. Well, in the brain, these are hierarchies of spiky neurons, all carrying out feature binding. And so we think that in the brain, all this rich information, semantic information in the visual areas and the motor areas is being projected up into central areas like prefrontal cortex, where we learn about causal relations in the world. And that world knowledge we use to guide our behavior. But the critical thing here is I'm going to suggest in order for us to learn about how the world works, we need all that rich semantic information that is not just a hierarchy of features left scattered in space, but also information about how those features are related to each other in order to be able to understand our world and learn those causal relations.
This sounds awesome. It sounds like kind of the holy grail of, what we've been trying to achieve for a long time. My question is, if you could give us a survey on where we stand as far as the state of the art of training these kinds of networks, because I believe, at least I think traditionally they've been much more difficult to train. Is that correct? And how's that going? Where do we stand now? Are they practically useful?
Okay, yeah. So the key thing is, as I said at the beginning, we always aim to build what we call biologically realistic models. And the sort of simulations we've developed, I'm sure there are other ways you could approach it. But the reason it's important to build biological models is because then, as you discover more about the neurobiology and how it works, you can incorporate that as you go along. And so now we're in a position to take those early behavior models and incorporate the spiking dynamics. And that's indeed one of the next steps we want to do.
Could I just gently challenge on that? You say that it's advantageous to model, let's say, biologically plausible networks, right? So with spiking dynamics. Yeah. Aren't these dynamics relevant in the substrate of biology? In the substrate of silicon, why should we try to model those dynamics?
Yeah. So this is my whole point about complex systems, because what we're ultimately interested in is the emergent behavior of the whole system. And my position is you only get that by simulating the dynamics right at the lowest level. And that means the interaction between the neurons. So when you think about picking up a cup, you don't just think, I've just picked up a cup. You're aware of all the motor primitives you use to pick up that cup. That's part of your experience. And I think it's also an important part of how we learn. So I think those hierarchical binding relations, both in vision, audition, other sensory areas, and in the motor systems, is really important for how our brain learns to operate flexibly in the real world, to interpret it and to operate flexibly.
You said something fascinating when you referenced the maze solving behavior. Now, we've spoken to Kenneth Stanley about this, and he came up with this concept called novelty search. And we spoke to Professor Friston last week. I'm sure you're aware of Friston's work, the free energy principle, and that's all about self-organized behavior. And what really differentiated Friston's work is that you're getting away from this kind of goal-directed, like in reinforcement learning systems, you have a value function and you need to have some kind of objective. And what you're describing here is some kind of self-organized behavior where you don't need to explicitly say what good looks like. It just kind of figures it out by itself. Do I understand that correctly?
Well, actually, when you're doing that, it's rather different to reinforcement learning, because when you're doing the learning, you don't need a reward signal. You just learn about the environment. You learn about the dynamics. The reward comes later on, which is rather interesting and much more flexible, I think. But let me just come back to that, I think, a deeper point, which is let's think about a mobile robot today. Do we actually need to go down this biological route? Let's think about how a mobile robot navigates around an environment today. Well, typically, they just keep a record of which parts of space are free of obstacles. Well, that's not how I operate in a complex environment. I see features at every spatial scale. And who knows how those features at every spatial scale and their relations are going to influence my intelligent behavior. But that's where it comes from. And I think we need that level of semantic richness, both in perception and in action, to be able to behave in a lifelike manner within real world environments. That's my suspicion. It's a postulate at this point, but it's what this is our direction of travel.
So given your mathematics background, I wonder if I could, and this gets to Tim's question about, do we need a particular feature? I know there's been a lot of interesting work on the computational capabilities of different flavors of neural networks. And for example, I think there are some results that if you have neurons that can have these deltas, these timing delays, that puts them in a computationally more powerful model, at least in the sense of, like, let's say VC dimension or Sontag dimension or something like that. I'm wondering if you can talk to that a little bit as to how much power you gain by having the ability to have these differential timings.
We're quite at an early stage with respect to that particular question. So let me tell you about an issue we've had with some of our rate-coded networks, which is the closest thing to a convolution network. So what I mean by a biological rate-coded network is basically a hierarchical series of competitive neural networks, which is unsupervised. So it's so without the spiking dynamics, rate-coded. And we've been developing a model called VisNet of the primate ventral visual pathway for 20 years, which is a hierarchical rate-coded model. And one of the problems we find is we lose the stimulus specificity if we train, for example, an output neuron on a letter T over all positions on the retina. You think about how you compute the activation of that output neuron. It does a sort of linear sum over the inputs. And that means that T neuron can become subject to false stimuli, where we can actually separate the elements of that T, maybe a horizontal and vertical bar, and we can fool the system into thinking it's a letter T. So there's a sort of lack of sensitivity there. But in a spiking network, those elements will be represented by these precise spatial temporal trains. Spatial temporal trains of spikes, and they have to arrive at the postsynaptic cell simultaneously in order to drive it. So you actually need a volley of spikes arriving simultaneously at a postsynaptic cell in order to drive it. And that can increase the specificity of those neurons. But I make that as my team have seen evidence of that in their simulations, but it's quite early for us. So you can see intuitively how the temporal codes can offer greater specificity and power in terms of computation, but we're quite at an early stage of investigating that.
I think we cut you off when you were talking about adversarial inputs to neural networks. And this relates to that probably quite directly, because there are hypotheses about why these adversarial inputs exist, and mostly they have to do with sort of decoupling features. So if I see a cat, there is the feature of, the general shape of the cat, but there is also the structure of the fur and the whiskers and so on. And these are very tiny features. And what these adversarial examples do, in some people's opinions, is they just take these tiny features that are not really visible to us humans, and they just crank them up, right? So they'll just take the whiskers feature and they just crank it up, or the fur structure, and they just crank it up a lot. And this never happens in nature, because the large features and the small features, they're always correlated. But in the adversarial example, this can fool the network. If I understand you correctly, if we implement these binding complexes, these 3 neuron complexes, then the third neuron, it will only fire if sort of the whiskers are part of the larger cat feature, right? So if the whisker structure or the fur structure is part of the actual fur, and the fur is part of the shape, and so on, and then these neurons will sort of encode these things firing as a whole. And that's why I think we cut you off, but that's why you probably went into this explaining this could solve one of these issues.
There's a number of things to mention there. So one issue I'm interested in is a problem which I call the picket fence. If you see a cat on the other side of the picket fence, you can see these different parts of the cat probably belong to the same cat. And so the mechanism you've just described is a way of solving that problem, that at each layer in the hierarchy, it will decide which features belong to the next feature up and so on. And that will go right the way up to the top. If we just come back to the problem of adversarial noise, one of my team has actually tried to adapt to CNN architecture to incorporate these sorts of binding neurons explicitly. And it can be done. There are a variety of ways of doing it. So to adapt a CNN architecture, so it begins to start to preserve and exploit explicit information about the hierarchical relations between features. And he's tested his network on black box adversarial attacks. And I think on the MNIST image set, he got quite preferable performance over other leading CNN architectures. But I probably shouldn't say too much more, because he's in the process of submitting it for publication. But what I'd like to add to that is that won't bind you everything primate vision can do, because I spoke earlier about this. In these unsupervised networks, you see the emergence of this hierarchy of visual shape primitives, which are themselves transform invariant. And that's probably part of the solution. And this is well known to neurophysiologists who study the primate visual system.
You're talking here about, similar to capsule networks, but more sophisticated, in my opinion, a kind of topology between features and how they kind of associate with each other. What about the partial information domain? You just said that, the cat is behind the picket fence. How is your system robust to some of those relationships not being seen?
So, and we haven't actually run that simulation yet, I should add. So that's my speculation. In other words, you think about this, the way the hierarchical binding works. It's simply if this neuron is driving that neuron, there's another neuron which will learn to represent that fact. So in other words, these binding neurons are representing causal relations between features, wherever, and that could occur throughout the brain in ways we haven't even begun to think about. So, you can imagine a situation, and it seems a bit trite to talk about it since we haven't run the simulations yet, where we've actually got cat features being represented on two sides of a picket fence, and they're driving up, and eventually you're stimulating a cat up here, but that cat up here is being driven by the features on either side of a vertical bar. We could imagine a situation like that. And not only that, when you think about, people talk about, where is the cat? Where is the cat? The cat is nowhere. What you see is where the features are. The cat is just a high level concept. What you see are the features. And so, and so in the early visual stages, those feature neurons have small receptive fields. And so those neurons not only carry information about the feature, but also where the feature is in retinal space. And so if you imagine you've got a binding neuron telling you this feature with a small receptive field is part of that larger feature with a large receptive field, that binding neuron also carries information about the position of that low level feature within the image. And so all of that is getting projected up.
It seems like there also has to be some top-down kind of generative modeling, like the free energy principle that we talked about, last week, kind of shows that most likely we are creating this generative model of the world and constantly comparing our predictions from that versus reality. And so when I see the cat behind the fence, I think it's a cat because in my mind, I have a model of a cat that if I simulate being behind the fence, actually matches what I would observe or what I'm observing right now, even though I may have never seen a cat behind the picket fence.
And so what we see in our simulations is a huge attractor state. So I'm talking about a hierarchical series of competitive layers, but actually you've got bottom up, top down, lateral connections. And so that essentially forms a huge attractor state. And where initially signals and you see this, neurophysiologists report this in the brain. So for example, neurophysiologists recording from neurons in area V2, cortical area V2, where you find neurons that look a bit like simple cells. So simple cells will respond to edges and bars and so on. But what they see is initially a cell responds like a simple cell to an edge in an image in its field, in its receptive field. What happens then, if you wait a little while, a few tens of milliseconds, the signals propagate up and come back down, and then it modulates its response. And those neurons start to encode which side of an object that edge is. And so what you've got is a global attractor state across all the layers. And of course, we see that in our spiking simulations. Yeah. So you've got that top-down influence.
I just want to add it as well as the future of models being generative. Max Welling said that causality is super important as well. So he said that causality allows us to easily transfer predictors from one domain to the next. So accidents, for example, are correlated with black cars in the Netherlands and perhaps with red cars in the US. But using color as a predictor doesn't generalize very well. But if you had a causal factor, such as male testosterone levels, that will generalize very well indeed. So I think it's super important that we introduce causality into these models.
You're absolutely right. How to do it is another matter. There's all sorts of potential high-level cognitions that could come into visual interpretation, and that's nasty. And we try and take things one step at a time.
So, what are you've spoken about vision and audio processing, and you went quite far up with audio processing, and generally in deep learning, these are really two separate fields. There is speech recognition, which is simply concerned with an audio signal and then resulting in text. And then there is natural language processing, which takes the text and processes it into whatever kind of meaningful processing we do with language, sometimes called natural language understanding. What is your view on these? Do you think this is a continuous sort of process in the brain, or is this what are your views on language?
Because the features you use to interpret the auditory world are the same features you use to interpret language. And again, we approach this using unsupervised competitive learning. So actually, one of the classic problems in audition is how the brain learns to represent pitch. And pitch is something extraordinary because it's not the same thing as frequency at all, because you can recognize a pitch even if you take out the fundamental frequency, you can hear the same pitch. And so how might that happen? So in I think 2 or 3 years ago, we published a paper. I think we're the first people to do this, where we had a hierarchical network. I think it was rate coded at the time, and we would just expose it to lots of different they're called complex tones. We have a fundamental and all the higher harmonics, and then you can you can control timbre by deciding which frequencies are going to be present. That's why you hear a piano or a violin, whatever. It's dependent on the actual frequencies dependent in the high harmonics. And we would just expose the network to all these different sounds, natural sounds, musical instruments, all sorts of things. And just through competitive learning, it would just learn to form a category of pitch, and then it could recognize pitch even if the fundamental frequency was missing. I've always thought that's rather similar to the problem of color constancy in vision, where of course the colors we see aren't real at all. Our brain just invents colors, and it's similar sort of processing which goes on, but it's unsupervised learning.
I can see how that arises. And do you have any thoughts on the higher up processing of language? So once you sort of know what's being said, how does meaning get in there? How do you derive from an audio signal? How do you actually derive what the other person wants to say?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So far, we simply, one of my former doctoral students, who's now at DeepMind, ran some simulations of exposing a hierarchical spiking net to language, and she found the emergence of these 3 neuron binding circuits, and what we call polychronization, which is this rich spatial temporal structure, spike trains. And she saw this just emerging naturally in her simulations. But that's as far as we've got. We haven't gone beyond that yet. So we take, this biological approach means tackling these sort of low level perceptual problems before getting onto sort of higher level stuff.
The audio just went a bit funny there. You were just talking about a harmonic series, which is fascinating. So, as you say, the harmonics are integer multiples of the fundamental frequency, and even in the absence of the fundamental frequency, we still perceive that pitch. And there are other things as well. The MP3 algorithm is optimized to take advantage of lots of perceptual oddities in human auditory system, right? Yeah. So our cochlea has these kind of weird critical bands of hearing which are logarithmically scaled and so on. And this kind of gets back to my original point, which is, isn't this stuff just hardware? Humans, we have a certain set of hardware, and it creates this perceptual mechanism. I mean, in the critical bands of hearing that we have, for example, one loud sound will make it impossible for us to detect a quieter sound in that critical band. And I think a loud sound in time will make it impossible for us to hear another sound directly afterwards, and so on. So isn't that just our hardware?
Yeah, so this is a really good point, because it's about what it is ultimately is dynamics. That's what it is. It's about dynamics, whether that's realized in whatever form of hardware you're using, whether it's silicon or carbon. It's about dynamics and dynamical behavior. So I mentioned earlier that one of my former lab members had run simulations exposing a hierarchical spiking network to just natural language, and saw the emergence of features like vowels and phonemes and words where there were hierarchical binding relations, neurons encoding hierarchical binding relations between those features. And because she was implementing this in a spiking net, I don't care how you do it, whether you do it on the GPU or in the brain, it's the dynamics which are important to the very nature of the sensory representations which emerge. It's the qualitative nature of those sensory representations which are critical.
If we could go back to using biology as inspiration for maybe features that or signposts, as you put it, for features that could be very useful in building intelligent systems. There's this kind of hierarchy that some people say, the first generation neural networks were those that were discrete, like the old perceptrons. Second generation were continuous and had weighted sums and nonlinear activation functions. Third generation are these kind that you're talking about, that had the ability to have timings, spike timings and whatnot is actual functional pieces of the neural network. If you had to guess what fourth generation would be, what would it be? So what features are we missing of actual neurons and or biological networks of neurons that we need to bring in next to further increase our capabilities?
Let me give you an answer to that, but perhaps not quite the answer you're anticipating. Let's think about spatial navigation. There's a very basic task. Now, you asked me about the architecture and dynamics of the neurons themselves. As I said, today's mobile robots, they might simply record which parts of an environment are free of obstacles. When you talk to neurophysiologists, what they'll tell you is they'll tell you about neurons found in the rat brain, monkey brain, that encode the position of an animal within its environment and the structure of that spatial environment. Well-known classes of cells include place cells, found in rats, early 1970s, found in the hippocampus of rats, which fire whenever the animal's in a particular place in its environment. So a population of cells like that will encode where the animal is. About a decade later, head direction cells were found, and these cells encode the current heading of the animal, whether it's a rat or a primate. So those are two different kinds of spatial representations, and we've been modeling the emergence of those representations. So we've got to the stage now where we can build a completely self-organizing system which we can drop into any sort of spatial environment. It will just explore that spatial environment, and these cells will emerge in a completely unsupervised, self-organizing manner. And it took us about 15 years to get to that point. Probably take us less time if we had more funding. But the really critical thing is that neurophysiologists report that actually these cells that are being reported are just the simplest kind of cells. You see a cell which responds whenever the animal's in a place, and you think, my God, that's such a simple, clean story. That's like Nobel Prize time for that. But there are lots of other cells that neurophysiologists observe with a more abstract firing properties that are clearly encoding spatial information about the world, but much more difficult to interpret what kind of information and what role they're playing. Yet all these cells are part of a rich tapestry of spatial representations which work together to support spatial navigation, spatial processing and navigation. And that's where we're headed as a lab, to try to build these large-scale simulations from sensory input to motor output, and if you're interested, the critical thing that allowed us to get these simulations to work was including not only the visual input, which other people have been doing, but it turns out we all know the brain has neurons encoding self-motion, like rotation of the head and forward velocity. So we actually included what are called idiothetic signals, self-motion signals, into the simulations, and they turn out to be critically important for actually guiding the emergence of these kinds of interesting cell properties. And so, for example, we found that head direction cells emerge in these simulations when we include not only the visual input, but also information from head rotation cells. These are called angular head velocity cells. So if you include an angular head velocity input, that drives the emergence of head direction cells. But if you replace the angular head velocity with a combination of forward velocity and head direction, you see the emergence of place cells. So, and because we've sort of cracked that problem now, we know these internal motion signals are really important to the self-organization of these spatial representations. Now we can go on to develop these simulated agents where we can look at a whole variety of different kinds of spatial representations which emerge and try to understand the nature of those representations within simulations and understand how they weave together to support robust navigation. That's one of the things we want to do going forwards. And so I haven't really answered your question, because what I'm saying is there's so much still to discover with the current generation of neural networks that I'm not really thinking about the next stages.
How do you know, right? Because neuroscience is an order of magnitude harder than the kind of stuff we do with artificial neural networks. But with your new type of computational architecture that you're describing, just to contrast, I mean, in the world of neural networks, we have all of these weird and wonderful ways of reasoning about their behavior, right? We things like counterfactual examples and data grouping, and we even solve a weird optimization problem to kind of go the other way through the network to, give us some idea of feature visualization or something. What kind of approaches are you using to make these statements about the behavior of your models?
Yeah. It is difficult. In fact, it's damn difficult. It really is, to try and interpret what's going on. I'll tell you what, one of the reasons it's so difficult is because what I've been talking about are polyclonus neuronal groups. This is a subpopulation of cells which are encoding a particular feature, whatever that feature is, and they encode that feature with a particular temporal pattern of spikes. So this neuron fires, that neuron fires, and so on like this. And they can be very rich and complex. But the real headache is that an individual neuron could participate in hundreds of these PNGs simultaneously. So you could have 100 of these polyclonus neuronal groups all sitting on top of each other with different periods. It looks just like an absolute mess. And I work with Oxford neurophysiologists trying to come up with ways of actually, but they're recording from, say, 100 neurons in the visual cortex out of maybe, 10 or 20 billion. And they're trying to, how can we actually, even identify the existence of these PNGs? Because if, you recorded from, say, 10 cells and they're all participating in hundreds of PNGs, it just looks like, where's the structure? How are you going to tease out the structure from that? And the same applies to our simulations. There are techniques for extracting PNGs, independent PNGs, but it really is difficult. And that's why, so far I've sort of focused on this 3-neuron binding circuit, because we could pin that down and we could look at the axonal delays and saw that the axonal delays were exactly what we predicted in terms of their relations in order to achieve that binding effect. But really going beyond that, and of course, I've talked about this neuron encoding a relationship between these two neurons, but this neuron can code all sorts of complex relationships on multiple levels. It's an absolute, and indeed, it may not be a neuron that's encoding that. It could be a subpopulation of cells encoding using a PNG encoding. It just goes on forever. It's honestly, I almost felt like retiring when I looked at this complexity. I feel it's something for the next generation. I'm very happy.
I wonder what would you say to the folks who say, you know what, don't worry. Actually, you don't need to worry about all that complexity because hey, we don't even need all these timing capabilities and whatnot. We just need GPT because right now, sure, it only has 10 to the 11th neurons, but by the time we get to GPT-5, it'll have 10 to the 15th, and maybe the next version after that will have plenty of neurons to do all the calculation we need, from this very simple substrate.
So here's my gut instinct. I was watching an interview with Rodney Brooks a few years back, and of course, well known for the COG project, I believe at MIT. So the humanoid robot. The media loved it because they could take photographs. And in early work, I'd hear them talking about this COG project, saying, "Yeah, well, next week we're going to add in an extra subroutine so it can track you with its eyes around the room. And a week after that, we'll do something else." And I think a lot of people listening to that would have a degree of skepticism about how far that approach is going to get, where you're sort of trying to layer on these additional cognitive capabilities in a step-by-step fashion. And I remember maybe 2 or 3 years back watching an interview with Rodney Brooks where he just sat there saying, "I've just come to the view after all these years that there's something missing. There's just something missing in this." And I felt the same thing as a postdoc looking at our model VisNet, something missing. And I think these hierarchical binding relations I've talked about, if you think about a classic CNN or one of our early rate coded networks, you've got a rich hierarchy of visual primitives, but there's no information about their relations. And that's just one example of something fundamental that's missing in terms of information processing. So it's the information processing which is important. And that depends on the neuronal dynamics. We've got to get that right. We've got to get the neuronal dynamics right. So during self-organization, as this thing is exposed to the sensory world, we get the right kinds of representations emerging in the network, representations we've not begun to think about yet. We're on the very first steps with this feature binding idea. This is why I take this complex systems approach and I try to follow the biology and see where it takes us. And that's why I feel in the longer term, this is the right way to go. Incidentally, I don't know whether I've mentioned it yet, but psychologists and philosophers have long regarded feature binding as the neural foundation of consciousness itself in the brain. And I think that's the right way of thinking about it. And certainly I would regard feature binding as a necessary platform for the future development of artificial general intelligence. I think we're going to build systems that can make sense of the world and behave flexibly within real world environments. We're going to need to solve feature binding in a really effective way and have all that information projected up. As I said, the phrase I use is a semantically complete representation of the world, because when you look at a visual scene, you can interpret what's happening at every spatial scale. And I'm sure that's important for supporting flexible behavior in real world environments.
I think that the feature binding is absolutely fascinating, but I want to just take a step back to what you said at the beginning, because you said before you got to the feature binding, you made a lot of headway on continuous transformation learning and trace learning, and those were absolutely critical for learning these invariant representations. So could you just fill in that gap as well?
Yeah, sure. So we're sort of doing this in reverse, but this is one of the very early problems I worked on. So the challenge here is not just to get a network to recognize an object from different viewpoints. It's how could this happen within a biologically realistic network where we can't tell the network what it's looking at on any occasion? And we're constrained in the kind of learning rules we use. So they should be local rules. That means the information you use to adapt to synaptic connection has to be locally available. So in other words, something like the firing rates of the pre and post synaptic cells of the synapse is used to modify that synapse. So those are, like, if you like, the rules of the game. As I said, they're not really rules, they're signposts. But anyway, that was an early problem we worked on. And so continuous transformation learning is actually trace learning was proposed first by, I think it was a chap called Peter Foldiak. And the idea of both these mechanisms is that they exploit the natural statistics of the visual world. So for example, you've just been sat looking at me for about an hour and 15 minutes. And so all these different views of my face have been clustered together in time. So there's temporal continuity. Could the visual system exploit that kind of temporal continuity? And indeed, trace learning does exactly that. So if you take a standard Hebb rule and you replace either the pre-synaptic firing rate or the post-synaptic firing rate with a memory trace, just something reflecting recent activity, the system will automatically it will form neurons which learn to go to input patterns which tend to occur close together in time. And if we assume in the visual world different transforms of an object tend to occur close together in time, then such a network can learn transform invariance. Of course, it runs into problems if you're actually saccading rapidly around a scene and you're mixing up different objects. The system can get confused. And so that's a limitation of that kind of learning. And then later came continuous transformation learning, which is something I proposed, which uses spatial similarity. So all the different transforms you've seen of me as I rotate my head form a continuum of rather similar images. And one of these sorts of biological networks can actually exploit that continuity to form output neurons which can respond to that whole continuum. And so these are two local learning mechanisms which operate very effectively to develop invariant representations. And these invariant representations can emerge at every level in the hierarchy. So this is what we see. We see neurons in the early layers, which are learned to encode elemental features, develop some degree of transform invariance. And that means later on, if we show a novel object, they can be encoded by the same alphabetic primitives, where because those primitives are transform invariant, the thing can then carry out one-shot object recognition.
What category exactly of invariance are they learning? Is it affine invariance or something else?
It could be anything, because just think about it. The way these mechanisms work is they'll just associate together images which either occur close together in time, in the case of trace learning, or are rather similar to each other. They form a sort of continuum of rather similar images. So they can learn rotation invariance, scale invariance, view invariance, any sort of invariance you might care to think of.
Can they also learn sort of warping invariance or
We can taught it that, but of course what they key off is what they see in the natural world. So if a certain kind of invariance is not really very natural, they're not going to learn it because they have to be exposed to that kind of invariance.
But do I understand correctly that you're almost transforming it into a kind of non-geometric problem, so you kind of get that for free?
Yes.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's biologically plausible. And we've gone on to replicate those learning mechanisms in spiking nets.
I was going to take a step back, and you talk a lot about biological plausibility, but you mainly run these sort of simulations. Could you just talk to us, how do you work together with biologists to make sure that what you're doing is biologically plausible and to translate your findings into what it means for the brain and so on? How does your work look like, in conjunction with these people?
Because we're building neural network models, I think the primary experimental data we're interested in is what we call single or multi-unit recording. This is where a neurophysiologist puts an electrode or an array of electrodes into part of an animal's brain and records how those cells are firing as an animal undertakes a task, which might be just looking at images on a screen, or it might be wandering through a spatial environment. So I used to work with neurophysiologists at Oxford who were carrying out experiments on macaques. And so in one study, for example, they would record from an area known as the hippocampus as the animal wandered around its room. And at Oxford, they discovered what are called spatial view cells in the macaque brain. These are cells that fire whenever the animal's looking at a particular part of the room. And then so we would characterize the firing properties of those cells. And then we think about how can we build a simulation to show how those cells could emerge. Let me give you another example, and I like to tease my undergraduates with this example. Some neurophysiologists have found neurons that encode the position of an object, a visual object, not with respect to the retina, but with respect to another part of the body, such as the head or the hand. So, for example, here's my pen, and you see this configuration like this. Here's my hand, here's the pen. And you will find a neuron in the macaque brain which will respond to that configuration where that pen is in this position with respect to the hand. And that same neuron will fire wherever you show those on the retina. But if I move the pen to a different position with respect to the hand, and then a different cell will fire. So these cells are encoding the positions of object in different body-centered frames of reference, where that body-centered frame of reference might be the hand or the head. And my lab has, when I first read about those cells, there's no idea of how they could develop. Those cells are thought to be very important, though, encoding the position of an object with respect to the hand explicitly is thought to underpin our ability to reach out and grab an object. Okay, so those are important classes of cells. And no one ever, when these cells were discovered, no one ever said, here's how we think they develop. Well, how do they develop? There's an interesting question for a theoretician. And it didn't immediately occur to me how to solve that problem. I thought, that's a very interesting class of cell. I've seen other classes of cells which I didn't know how to solve immediately. But in this particular case, and I've given you enough information to solve it already. How would you solve that?
Well, do you mean to solve the development problem?
Yeah, exactly. How would you build a biologically plausible model from what I said so far in this interview to solve that problem? How would you build a model in which these kinds of hand-centered neurons can emerge through some sort of self-organizational learning process?
Are you okay if we use Python?
Yes, I am. But just come up with a suggestion, a theoretical suggestion. This is what we do. You've asked me what we do with theoreticians. This is what we do.
I suppose you need sort of a experience, lots of experience of grabbing things, right? Like of the viewpoint of an animal as it grabs things or reaches for things, and then the success or failure of the grabbing will sort of be dependent on where objects are with respect to the hand, right? So I don't know how to do it without a reward signal, but I guess with a reward signal of actually successfully or not successfully grabbing something, the feature of where something is in relation to the hand would be some kind of a natural emergent thing.
I'm thinking maybe I would need data about the direction that my eyes are looking and the direction that my hand is oriented, and looking for synchronous kind of alignment of those variables or inputs.
People assume, we talk about humans as having extreme generalization. And that's not really the case. We can't recognize faces upside down. And there's actually a very kind of heliocentric and anthropocentric skew to a lot of our cognition. We're really, really bad at anything in 4D, for example, and the traveling salesman problem. We can't really do that beyond about 20 cities. So people exaggerate that notion.
Okay, let me put you out of your misery, because it's an important point. This is what we do as theoreticians. We try to solve problems like that. And if I put that problem to a neurophysiologist, they wouldn't be able to answer it. And disappointingly, sometimes my students can't answer it even after they've taken my undergraduate program in computational neuroscience. So if we think about the learning mechanisms I just described to you, trace learning and CT learning, you think about what might happen ecologically. An animal might have an object with a certain position with respect to the hand, but all the time you're saccading around the place the whole time. You've got microsaccades and larger saccades, and what that will result in is lots of different images of that hand object configuration being fed into your brain, your visual brain, all clustered close together in time. And so we simply run a simulation where the animal is simply looking around the place, and you can do this with multiple objects, and then I won't go into the details of that, but you can put a hand against a natural background, it still works. If you employ either trace learning or CT learning, where in trace learning a neuron will learn to respond to images which occur close together in time. In CT learning, the neurons will learn to respond to images which are similar to each other. That's enough. If you just expose it to you train it on a visual input stream as an animal just saccading around the environment with its hand steady against the background or with another object present, those hand-centered neurons automatically develop as a property of transform invariance learning. People have written whole books on saccade behavior and fixation. Microsaccades, you just do that subconsciously all the time anyway. If you stabilize an image on the retina, you'll go blind eventually. So your visual system needs to perform microsaccades all the time. And then larger saccades, they can be driven by all sorts of processes. They could be bottom-up processes or top-down processes. If someone important walks into a room, you automatically tend to look at them. But also other things like primitive visual elements can cause you to pay attention to one part of the visual scene. So we're saccading all the time, a number of saccades every second. And so the assumption then in the simulation is that you're performing saccades more rapidly than you're moving your hand. And that's, so in other words, the hand is relatively steady against a background while you're saccading around the place. That will result in a series of images of that particular hand object configuration, different positions on your retina, and they'll get bound together by either trace learning or CT learning, and that will create a hand-centered neuron.
So frames per second matter. I always knew I should aim for higher FPS in video games. Now I know why.
Dr. Simon Stringer, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute honor. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you today.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. It really has. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Bye-bye.